The letter arrived smelling of antiseptic and death. Commander William Harker read it standing on the cigarette deck of USS Silversides while Pearl Harbor spread before him like a graveyard. Seaman First Class Robert Chen had died of his wounds at 0347 hours. Peritonitis from shrapnel. He was 19 years old and had been engaged to a girl in Sacramento who would receive a telegram before the sun set. Harker folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket alongside 2 others. 3 men dead from their last patrol. The previous captain had sat in his quarters for 6 days refusing to surface the boat, convinced Japanese destroyers were everywhere. They'd relieved him at Midway, and now Harker inherited a submarine that whispered of bad luck through every rivet and weld. The Silversides was a Gato-Class boat, 311 feet of steel designed to prowl the Pacific and strangle Japan's supply lines. She carried 24 torpedoes, a crew of 60 men, and enough ghosts to fill her ballast tanks. Harker knew the statistics that Admiral Lockwood kept posting in the briefing rooms. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate that would cripple the empire within 2 years. What the statistics never mentioned was how many submarines simply vanished, crushed by depth charges or swallowed by the sea. That he descended the forward hatch and found his executive officer waiting in the control room. Lieutenant Commander James Tanaka stood with perfect posture, his uniform pressed despite the humidity that made everything stick. Tanaka's face revealed nothing, a skill he'd perfected since December 1941, when being Japanese-American became a liability that could end careers or worse. "The crew is assembled in the forward torpedo room, Captain," Tanaka said. "Chief Morrison is managing expectations." Harker understood the pause. Morrison had served under 3 captains on this boat. He trusted none of them and made no secret of it. The man had been torpedoing Japanese ships when Harker was still learning navigation at Annapolis. The forward torpedo room smelled of grease, sweat, and the peculiar staleness of recycled air. 60 faces watched Harker enter, some hostile, some indifferent, most simply tired. These men had been underwater for weeks at a time, hunted by destroyers, eating cold food because cooking created smells that could be detected. They'd watched friends die and wondered daily if they'd be next. "I won't insult you with speeches," Harker said. "You know what we're here to do. The Japanese are shipping oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. Every tanker we sink is a factory that goes dark in Osaka. Every freighter we destroy is a regiment that goes hungry in Burma." He paused, meeting eyes that challenged him to prove himself. "I know what happened on the last patrol. I know you don't trust me. You don't have to trust me. You just have to do your jobs until I've earned it." Chief Morrison stood against the torpedo racks, arms crossed. His face was leather and salt, carved by 20 years of submarine service. "And if you break like the last one, Captain?" The room went silent. Harker felt the weight of every stare. "Then you throw me in the brig and Tanaka takes command." Harker turned to his executive officer. "That acceptable to you, XO?" Tanaka nodded once. "Entirely, Captain." Something shifted in the room, not trust, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of resistance. Morrison's eyes narrowed, reassessing point. 3 days later, they departed Pearl Harbor on their war patrol. The Silverside slipped beneath the waves and became a shadow, running on her diesel engines when surfaced, switching to battery power when submerged. They traveled 1,500 miles toward the shipping lanes off Luzon, where Japanese convoys moved like blood through arteries, keeping the empire alive. On the 8th night, Harker stood in the conning tower when the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom. "Contact bearing 045. Single vessel. Range 12,000 yards." It was a small freighter, perhaps 3,000 tons, nothing that would make headlines. But Harker ordered battle stations anyway. The crew moved through the boat with the precision of men whose lives depended on every action. Tanaka plotted the approach. Morrison supervised the torpedo room. They fired 2 torpedoes at 800 yards. Both hit. The freighter broke apart in flames that reflected off the black water like dying stars. No one cheered. There might have been men on that ship, conscripted sailors, prisoners being transported, civilians. The crew of Silversides watched in silence as the vessel slipped beneath the surface, leaving only burning oil and debris. Harker looked at his men and saw something new in their faces. Not celebration. Something harder. They had killed together. Whatever came next, they would face it as a crew. The message from Fleet Intelligence arrived at midnight. A convoy of 14 merchant ships would transit their patrol zone in 6 days. 8 escorts. The largest target Silversides had ever been assigned. Harker read the dispatch twice, then looked at the photographs in his pocket. By this time next week, he would either add more, or become one himself. 14 ships stretched across the horizon like a floating city, their silhouettes black against the orange dawn. Commander Harker pressed his eye to the periscope and counted destroyers, 8 escorts weaving through the formation like sheepdogs guarding a flock. Somewhere in that convoy were oil tankers carrying fuel that would power Japanese aircraft, ammunition ships loaded with shells destined for American positions, and supply vessels keeping 1 million enemy soldiers fed and fighting. The Silversides had been stalking them for 36 hours. Running submerged by day, surfacing at night to charge batteries and close the distance, they had crept into position like a wolf circling prey too large to attack carelessly. Every man aboard understood the mathematics of submarine warfare: one mistake, one miscalculation, and the hunter became the hunted. Range to lead tanker, 4,000 yards, Tanaka announced from the plotting table. His voice carried no emotion, but his hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he tracked the convoy's zigzag pattern. Japanese captains had learned to vary their courses unpredictably, making torpedo solutions a constant calculation of geometry and guesswork. Harker swept the periscope across the escorts. The nearest destroyer bore the hull number 182, Hiroshima, according to Fleet Intelligence. Her captain had a reputation. 3 American submarines had entered her patrol zone in the past year. None had returned. Chief, status of the forward tubes. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, calm despite the tension crackling through the boat. Tubes 1 through 4 loaded and ready. Outer doors closed. Open outer doors on tubes 1 through 4. The mechanical clunk echoed through the hull. Every man aboard knew that sound, the point of no return. With the outer doors open, the Silversides was committed to attack. They waited. The convoy crawled closer at 11 knots. Harker watched the lead tanker grow in his periscope, her hull riding low with the weight of oil desperately needed in Japan. American intelligence estimated that Japanese industry required 6 million tons of oil annually to sustain the war effort. Submarines like Silversides were draining that supply 1 tanker at a time. Firing solution set, Tanaka reported. Recommend firing on my mark. Harker took one final look. The tanker filled his periscope view, fat, slow, and completely unaware that death waited beneath the waves. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. The boat shuddered as compressed air ejected torpedoes from their tubes. Each Mark 14 torpedo weighed 3,000 pounds and carried 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. They streaked through the water at 46 knots, trailing wakes that would be invisible from the surface. 47 seconds. That was the calculated run time to target. The crew counted silently. Some moved their lips. Others gripped whatever was nearest, pipes, railings. Each other. 3 explosions ripped through the morning. The lead tanker erupted in flames that climbed 200 feet into the sky. A second tanker broke in half, her stern rising vertically before sliding beneath the surface. A freighter listed hard to starboard, smoke pouring from a wound below her waterline. 3 hits confirmed, Tanaka said. 1 torpedo failure or miss. But there was no time for celebration. The escorts were already turning, their bows cutting white furrows through the sea as they raced toward the submarine's position. Dive. Make your depth 300 feet. The Silversides plunged toward the darkness below. Harker gripped the periscope housing as the deck tilted beneath him. Around him, men moved with desperate efficiency, closing hatches, shutting valves, bleeding air from tanks to drive the boat deeper. The first depth charge exploded 200 yards away. The concussion slammed through the hull like a giant's fist, knocking men off their feet and shattering light bulbs. Then came another. And another. Hiroshima is directly overhead, the sonar operator reported, his voice tight with controlled fear. She's pinging active sonar. Harker ordered silent running. The diesel engines went dead. The electric motors dropped to minimum power. Men stopped talking, stopped moving, barely breathed. In the red-lit darkness of the submarine, 60 souls listened to the screws of a destroyer passing overhead, a sound like death circling. The depth charges continued for 3 hours. The Silverside sat at 320 feet, deeper than her design specifications, her hull groaning under pressure that wanted to crush her like an aluminum can. Rivets popped. Pipes cracked. Water sprayed into compartments where men worked frantically to stem the flooding. In the forward torpedo room, a malfunction trapped Morrison's hand in the tube mechanism while he attempted repairs. Tanaka found him there, blood streaming down his arm, refusing to scream because sound could kill them all. Together, in absolute silence, they freed him, Morrison biting through his own lip to keep from crying out. When the depth charges finally stopped, the Hiroshima moved away to rejoin the convoy's survivors. But Harker knew the destroyer captain hadn't given up. The oil leaking from Silversides left a trail on the surface, a signpost pointing directly at them. They had sunk 3 ships and crippled themselves in the process. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, the Hiroshima waited. And the night was far from over. The hull screamed. Metal bent in ways it was never designed to bend, producing sounds that crawled into men's minds and nested there like parasites. Commander Harker stood in the control room of USS Silversides, watching water drip from a crack that hadn't existed an hour ago, and calculated how long they had left to live. 8 hours submerged. 300 feet down, resting on a thermocline layer that scattered sonar returns and bought them invisibility. The air had grown thick and poisonous, carbon dioxide levels rising because they couldn't run the scrubbers without power, and they couldn't use power without creating noise that would draw the Hiroshima back to finish what she'd started. Oxygen levels at 14%, the engineering officer reported. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had already accepted death. We've got maybe 4 hours before men start losing consciousness. Above them, the destroyer waited. Her captain had positioned her directly over the oil slick that marked Silverside's grave, patient, professional, certain that his prey would eventually have to surface or suffocate. Harker looked at his crew. Some had wrapped themselves in blankets against the cold that seeped through the hull at depth. Others stared at nothing, their minds retreating from a reality too terrible to process. Near the forward hatch, a young torpedo man named Kowalski had begun whimpering, a sound that grew louder with each passing minute. He's going to crack, Morrison whispered. The chief's injured arm hung in a makeshift sling, but his eyes remained sharp. I've seen it before. Men who can't handle the waiting. They do something stupid. As if summoned by the words, Kowalski suddenly lunged for the hatch mechanism. I can't breathe, he screamed. I can't breathe. We have to get out. 3 men tackled him before he could reach the wheel. The struggle was brief and terrible, Kowalski thrashing, sobbing, begging them to let him die quickly instead of slowly. Morrison limped over and knelt beside the young sailor, speaking in a voice too low for others to hear. Whatever he said, Kowalski eventually went still, tears streaming down his face, but no longer fighting. Tanaka appeared at Harker's elbow. Captain, I have an idea. It's risky. Everything's risky. Talk. We're leaking oil from the port fuel bunker. The Japanese are tracking that slick, waiting for us to surface. Tanaka spread a chart on the plotting table, his movements deliberate despite the exhaustion that darkened his eyes. What if we give them what they want to see? Pump out the remaining oil from that bunker, along with debris, mattresses, clothing, anything that floats. Create a slick that looks like a submarine breaking apart. They'll investigate. Yes. And while they're investigating, we slip away on batteries. Minimum speed, maximum depth. Harker studied the chart. It meant traveling 12 miles underwater on failing batteries, through waters they hadn't properly surveyed, toward a rendezvous point that might or might not be safe. One mechanical failure, one navigational error, and they'd surface directly in front of Japanese guns, but the alternative was dying right here, crushed by pressure or suffocated by their own breath. Do it. The next 2 hours were controlled chaos. Men stripped their bunks, gathering mattresses and personal belongings to be sacrificed. The remaining oil was pumped overboard along with cork insulation, wooden damage control beams, and a uniform jacket with Morrison's name stenciled inside, a deliberate touch to convince the enemy that American sailors had died here. At 2,300 hours, Silversides began her escape. Electric motors humming at their lowest setting, she crept away from the debris field while above them. The Harrisame moved to investigate the sudden bloom of oil and wreckage. Through the sonar headphones, the operator tracked the destroyer's movements. She stopped. Picking up debris. I can hear voices. Japanese sailors examining the evidence of their kill. Somewhere up there, an officer was probably radioing Tokyo with news of another American submarine destroyed. They traveled for 6 hours in absolute darkness, navigating by dead reckoning and prayer. Men took turns breathing from emergency oxygen canisters, fighting the headaches and nausea of carbon dioxide poisoning. 2 sailors collapsed and didn't wake up, their bodies laid out in the torpedo room, covered with blankets that wouldn't be needed anymore. When Silversides finally surfaced at dawn, 30 miles from where they'd been attacked, the crew stumbled onto the deck like men emerging from tombs. The Pacific stretched empty around them, beautiful and terrible in its indifference. Harker conducted the burial at sea himself. 2 canvas bags slipped over the side, weighted with shell casings, carrying men who had survived battles only to die from bad air. Their names would be added to the submarine memorial at Pearl Harbor, another entry in a list that grew longer every month. The radio crackled with an emergency transmission. An American pilot was down in the water 60 miles north, broadcasting on the rescue frequency. Fleet headquarters responded immediately. USS Silversides, disregard. Proceed to Brisbane for repairs. Do not, repeat, do not attempt rescue. Area heavily patrolled. Harker was about to acknowledge when Tanaka handed him the decoded pilot information. The name stopped his heart, Lieutenant Thomas Harker. His younger brother. Dawn broke over the Solomon Sea like fire spreading across water, painting the waves in shades of blood and gold. Commander Harker stood on the bridge of USS Silversides and stared north, toward enemy waters, toward his brother. 60 miles. In peacetime, a distance crossed in hours. In war, a journey measured in survival odds that grew worse with every nautical mile. The crew deserves to know, Tanaka said quietly. He had not slept in 3 days, but his uniform remained pressed, his bearing unchanged. They've earned the right to decide. Harker had considered giving orders. A captain's authority was absolute. He could turn north and the men would follow because the Navy demanded obedience. But these men had followed him through depth charges and suffocation, had buried their friends and watched their boat nearly die. They were no longer just his crew. They were something closer to brothers themselves. That he assembled them on the forward deck, 60 faces -2, illuminated by morning light that seemed too peaceful for the conversation about to happen. The pilot in the water is my brother, Harker said. No preamble, no softening. His name is Thomas. He's 23 years old, and by tonight he'll either be rescued, captured, or dead. Fleet Command has ordered us to Brisbane. They've calculated that one pilot isn't worth a damaged submarine and her crew. He paused. I'm not ordering anyone to disobey that calculation. I'm asking if you're willing to. Silence. The only sound was the slap of waves against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds. Morrison stepped forward. His injured arm was still bandaged, his face still carved from years of salt and war. I didn't survive that convoy to become a man who leaves people behind. I've buried enough friends to know what regret costs. He turned to face the crew. I say we go get him. One by one, hands rose. Torpedo men. Engineers. The cook. The radio man. Kowalski, whose breakdown seemed like ancient history now, raised both hands as if voting twice could add weight to his choice. Tanaka raised his hand last. My family is in a camp in Utah, he said. Locked up because people decided their faces made them enemies. This country took everything from them and still asked me to serve. I serve because I believe we can be better than our worst decisions. He met Harker's eyes. Let's be better. Silversides turned north. They ran on the surface to save battery power, pushing the diesel engines to maximum while damage control teams worked frantically to patch leaking seams. The boat was wounded, limping, burning fuel she couldn't spare. But she moved. Japanese patrol aircraft appeared at noon, a twin-engine flying boat circling lazily on the horizon. Silversides crash-dived, wading beneath the waves while the plane passed overhead. They surfaced and continued. Another plane. Another dive. The delay cost precious hours, and somewhere in the water ahead, Thomas Harker clung to a life raft and watched the sky for rescue that might never come. They found him at dusk. The yellow raft floated in a patch of debris, surrounded by oil slicks from his downed aircraft. Thomas was barely conscious, dehydrated, sunburned, waving weakly when the submarine's silhouette broke the surface. Get him aboard, Harker ordered. Move. A rescue party launched in the inflatable, paddling furiously toward the raft. Thomas tried to stand, stumbled, was caught by Morrison, who had insisted on going despite his injuries. Then the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom, contact bearing 170. Destroyer, range 8,000 yards, closing fast. Harker raised his binoculars. The Hiroshima emerged from the twilight like a ghost, sleek, lethal, and headed directly for them. Her captain had been tracking debris that didn't match a submarine's destruction. He had doubted. And now he had found his answer. All hands, battle stations. The rescue party reached Thomas and hauled him into the inflatable. They paddled back while the destroyer closed the distance, her forward guns already training on the submarine. Tubes 5 and 6, make ready. Harker shouted. They had 2 torpedoes left. 2 chances. Thomas came aboard, collapsed onto the deck, was dragged below by waiting hands. The hatch slammed shut. Dive. Make your depth 100 feet. Silversides plunged beneath the waves as the first shells from Hiroshima exploded overhead. The destroyer was 3,000 yards away, too close for a comfortable attack, too far for her depth charges to be immediately lethal. Harker watched through the periscope as Hiroshima bore down on them. In that moment, he understood that the Japanese captain was not a monster but a mirror, a man doing his duty, protecting his people, fighting a war he hadn't chosen. Firing solution, he asked. Set, Tanaka replied. But Captain, if we miss, we've got nothing left. Harker didn't hesitate. Fire 5. Fire 6. The last torpedo streaked through the water. For 40 seconds, nobody breathed. .2 explosions merged into one. The Hiroshima broke apart amidships, her bow and stern rising separately before sliding beneath the surface. Oil and fire spread across the water where a warship had been. No cheers came from the crew of Silversides. They had survived. They had rescued one of their own. And they had killed men who deserved to go home just as much as they did. 3 days later, Silversides limped into Brisbane Harbour. Fleet Command sent a message of reprimand for disobeying orders, followed immediately by a message of commendation for destroying a Japanese destroyer despite critical damage. The war was full of such contradictions. Harker stood on the deck as tugboats guided them to the pier. Thomas sat beside him, recovered enough to walk but still weak. Around them, the crew of Silversides watched the Australian shoreline grow closer, men who had been strangers 8 weeks ago and were now something that transcended military terminology. Thank you, Thomas said quietly. Harker shook his head. Don't thank me. Thank them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photographs, not the dead, but the living. 60 faces -4. Men who had chosen to risk everything for someone they'd never met because that was who they wanted to be. The Gato-Class submarines would sink over 1,000 more Japanese vessels before the war ended. History would remember them as weapons. Harker would remember them as coffins that became cradles, steel wombs that carried men into darkness and somehow, impossibly, brought most of them back into light. Silver sides touched the pier. The war continued. But for one moment, surrounded by men who had become family, Commander William Harker allowed himself to believe that survival meant something more than just not dying. That it meant choosing, every day, to be worth saving.